All right, well, Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series, hosted by the UNM Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're thankful for everyone that's coming in to attend for us today at the start of this new year. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at the University of New Mexico. A couple of things before we get started. If you have questions that you would like to ask our panelists, you'll ask them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box below. Anytime you feel comfortable, we will hold those questions until the end. We try to get to as many as possible, but just bear with us if we don't get to yours. For those of you that want continuing education credits, you don't have to stay longer than the full hour. I'll try to let you know when that hour has passed. We might stay longer to answer some questions. For those that are pursuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet in the chat shortly. For APA continuing education credits, there will be a link to a survey that comes up near the end of the hour. Make sure you open that before you leave Zoom and make sure you save the certificate after you complete the survey. We don't get access to those certificates, so we can't send you CE credits after the fact. As a heads up for next week's talk will be by Dr. Dan Murray, who will be discussing mitigation evaluations in capital cases. But for this week, to kick off the new year of the Law and Mental Health series, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to today's speaker, who'll be discussing different practices, prevention, and policy issues related to sexual grooming, Dr. Elizabeth Jeglic. Dr. Jeglic is a professor of psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. Her research interests are primarily focused on issues broadly related to sexual violence prevention. She's published over 150 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and is the co-author or editor of 6 books, including Child Sexual Grooming, Integrating Research, Practice, Prevention, and Policy, Sexual Offending, Evidence-Based Legislation and Prevention, and the general audience geared Protecting Your Child from Sexual Abuse, What You Need to Know to Keep Your Kids Safe. She's also the former associate editor of the Journal of Sexual Abuse, the co-director of the Sex Offender Research Lab at John Jay College, and was awarded the Fay Honey Knopp Award from New York ATSA for her contributions to the prevention of sexual violence. I can also say from a personal and professional level that she is also a fantastic mentor to forensic trainees. Elizabeth, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, and of course myself personally, we're very excited to have you join this series. It's an honor, and I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, for that lovely welcome, and welcome everyone, and Happy New Year. It's so nice to be here with you. I hope you all had a restful break. I know that I was able to sleep 10 hours for, I think, 7 days in a row, so I am reinvigorated, hopefully, and that will come across in my presentation today. So just to let you know, I do not have any financial benefits from this. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about sexual grooming kind of holistically, and largely the work that my colleague Georgia Winters and I have been doing for the last 7 years. So we're going to discuss and understand the history and current state of research on sexual grooming. We'll discuss the sexual grooming model we developed and the identified sexual grooming behaviors and how those may vary depending upon the characteristics of the individual perpetrating the abuse, the person experiencing the abuse, and the context in which the abuse takes place. And then we'll discuss the implications of sexual grooming research for the prevention, detection, and prosecution of child sexual abuse. So I would like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Georgia Winters, who does this work with me and who contributed to these slides, and then Drs. Karen Terry, Leah Kaler, and Benjamin Johnson, who've also contributed to the work that I'm going to be presenting to you today. So just to give you a little bit of a background, most of you are probably familiar with the term sexual grooming by now, but it's a relatively new term in the field of sexual offending. It was really only in the mid kind of 1980s that it started to be recognized. In the late 70s, early 80s, most of the information that we had about child sexual abuse was focused on sexual abuse perpetrated by strangers and family members. And so that was kind of the stranger in the white van. And that myth of who perpetrates child abuse still is maintained today. The majority of people still think it is strangers who perpetrate child sexual abuse, when in reality, only 7% of all sexual abuse is perpetrated by a stranger, and 93% is perpetrated by someone known to the child, and about 30-ish% of those cases, it's a family member, and the rest are acquaintances or friends. About a third of all sexual abuse is actually perpetrated by another youth as well. And so it was only kind of in the mid kind of 1980s that the FBI started to recognize that some perpetrators were kind of integrating themselves in youth serving organizations, and you're using these kinds of luring techniques to gain access to children and to engage them in this type of relationship. And so it really only became known to the public that individuals employed in child serving organizations were perpetrating sexual abuse in the early 2000s, when we had the 2002 Boston Globe Catholic Church scandal came to light. In 2010, we found out about the breadth of sexual abuse within the Boy Scouts of America. And in 2004, Cheryl Shakeshaft published her report to the Department of Education, the Shakeshaft report about sexual abuse within, or sexual misconduct within educational institutions, suggesting that about 10% of children will experience sexual misconduct from a teacher. So we're starting to recognize that it is somebody other than family members or strangers who are perpetrating this abuse. The term grooming kind of got its nascence in 1984 in the FBI law report. They published a special edition on pedophilia, where they indicated that some individuals who want to sexually abuse children gain access to minors through their occupation using seductions to gain control over the child by employing games, gifts, and trips. So this was the first discussion of the term kind of seduction. Lanning, who is a part of this task force and who's written about grooming for the FBI, also said that they use the word luring to discuss these types of behaviors where a perpetrator tries to develop this type of relationship and uses these types of techniques like giving gifts and taking kids on trips in order to be able to perpetrate the abuse. In the 2000s, we saw theoretical papers and case studies, primarily from Craven and colleagues and McAlladin out of the UK, who wrote about sexual abuse and sexual grooming and how that might come to play. They talked about different models. They started to use the term more frequently. We saw case reports. And it was really only in the Sandusky case at Penn State. Many of you may remember, he was a football coach at Penn State, and he engaged in abuse of children who were participating in his youth organization. And so it was at that point that the term sexual grooming was revealed to the public. And, people now have varying degrees of knowledge about the term, but it is generally a term that we see more commonly, on news reports and in the popular media. When we started doing this work, kind of in the mid-2010s, there was no universal definition of sexual grooming. So, there were a varying number of definitions put forth. Most of them discussed some sort of a process or stage. They talked about manipulation and then various different techniques that were used. And I'll just read you a few examples. So McAlladin talked about the process in which a would-be abuser skillfully manipulates a child into situations where he or she can be more readily sexually abused and simultaneously less likely to disclose. The process by which a perpetrator isolates and prepares an intended victim. The steps taken by pedophiles to entrap their victims in some way analogous to adult courtship. The establishment and betrayal of affection and trust occupies a central role in the child molester's interactions with children, the sequence of behavior, the functions, preparation, and specific goals. So you can see kind of common themes that were emerging from this definition. But those of you who do research understand that in order to research a construct, you have to have a definition of the construct. And so that was what was kind of lacking in the field when we came here. At that point, I think there were about 13 different definitions, and they all kind of talked about the same types of things. And so what my colleague Georgia Winters did was she went through the literature and looked through all the different kind of descriptions of sexual grooming behavior, the different stages that were proposed, the different behaviors that were proposed. And so we kind of encompassed that into our model, and subsequently we developed a definition, which we're proposing as a universal definition, kind of targeting a lot of what was missing from the previous definitions and which would help kind of the field go forward. So we described sexual grooming as the deceptive process used by sexual abusers to facilitate sexual contact with a minor while simultaneously avoiding detection. Prior to the commission of the sexual abuse, the would-be sexual abuser may select a victim, gain access to and isolate the minor, develop trust with the minor and often their guardians, community and youth serving organizations, and desensitize the minor to sexual content and physical contact. Post-abuse, this is actually after the sexual abuse has happened, the offender may use maintenance strategies on the victim to facilitate future sexual abuse and or to prevent disclosure. So you can see that we kind of took a lot of what was happening in previous definitions and summarized it in one definition here. And you'll see how that kind of falls into our model and the subsequent behaviors and measure that we've developed. So what some of the previous definitions had in common was that they wanted to gain the initial cooperation of the child. So what they kind of do is they form this relationship, and that's at the heart of sexual grooming, is the formation of a relationship with a child. And so in many cases, the child trusts the person that is about to abuse them. They often select individuals who are vulnerable for a variety of reasons. They may be lacking in parental supervision, or they might feel unloved. And the person who wants to perpetrate the abuse kind of preys on that and fills that need for them and develops kind of a relationship with them, so that in a way they kind of get the child to, and I say cooperate loosely, but they form a relationship so that they are the child is attached to them. And so they gradually start to break down the boundaries so that the sexual abuse can happen, and that the boundaries are not so obvious to the child. And then once the sexual abuse has already happened, the child doesn't want to lose that relationship, or they're too scared to disclose. And so we found that using sexual grooming strategies decreases the likelihood that the child will disclose and increases the likelihood of future sexual contact. So using these strategies, they kind of keep the child enmeshed into this cycle of sexual abuse. And so they fear, either repercussions of disclosure, or they don't want to lose the relationships. And so the child, does not disclose what has happened to them. It has previously been estimated that anywhere between 30 and 45% of all child sexual abuse involves some elements of child sexual grooming. In a recent study that we did, 99% of the cases, people reported at least one sexual grooming behavior. So it is a very common feature of child sexual abuse, and I think very important that we're talking about it today. And you'll see as we talk about the implications why that is. One of the biggest kind of impediments to the child sexual grooming literature is that many of the behaviors sexual grooming behaviors mimic normal adult-child interactions. So, giving children gifts, or giving praise to children, or spending time or showing children attention are normal and healthy adult-child interactions. If you're familiar with the mentoring research, those are all the kinds of behaviors that we want mentors to engage in. So when do those kinds of behaviors, these sexual grooming behaviors, when do they kind of cross the line from being, things that can be helpful and supportive of young people to something nefarious and indicative of potential sexual abuse? And I'll talk about some research that we did to answer that question momentarily. But the type of what we have come to find out in our research is the type of what distinguishes sexual grooming behaviors from healthy adult-child interactions are the context in which the behavior happens. For example, if it's a parent or an uncle or aunt telling the child, "I love you and you're special," or having the child, stay overnight at an uncle's house may be a normative behavior. However, but it might not be a normative behavior for somebody in a youth serving organization to do overnight, to take the child overnight, or to tell the child, "I love you," or "you're special" multiple times. The type of behavior might also depend on the characteristics of the victim. So depending on the victim age. So we found that the use of drugs and alcohol is a sexual grooming behavior with adolescents, but not so much with children under the age of 12. And it also might depend on the characteristics of the offender. So are they a man or a woman? How do they know the child? In what context do they know the child? Where are they working with them? There's also a literature, but it's much less developed. It's more theoretical at this point. But sexual grooming can also include self-grooming. So that's kind of what has historically been known as cognitive distortion. So the The perpetrator may groom themselves, so they don't necessarily recognize that what they're doing is harmful to the child. There's debate as to whether, sexual grooming is a planful behavior or not. Like, are people aware that they're doing this, or is this like, manipulative, or is this something that they kind of do in the context of the abusive behavior? What we see very frequently is that the family of the minor is groomed. So the perpetrator integrates themselves into the family. They are welcomed in. The parents and the guardians then learn to trust this individual. They feel like they are somebody who is worthy of their trust, and they will maybe, give their child over to them, or feel less worried with their child around that person because they feel they are trusting. And so the perpetrator has groomed the family. And then they also, as we've learned from a lot of these scandals, groom institutions and communities. So, while we were initially taught to look for strangers in a white van, and if you ask people to describe people who perpetrate child sexual abuse, they'll often describe, kind of monsters. But what we've come to recognize is that these are often pillars of our community. These are priests, these are doctors, these are lawyers, these are, teachers, leaders. And so they integrate themselves within these institutions that serve our youth. And they're often people who, are commended for their behavior within these institutions. And so when allegations against them arise, people, tend to discount them because they know them to be such outstanding members of our community. The other thing that kind of hinders our ability to detect sexual grooming behaviors is what is called the hindsight bias. I knew it all along. So that's a phenomenon when, given the outcome information, people are much more likely to overestimate their ability to have determined the outcome before. So that was kind of like in the Sandusky case, for example. Once it came out that he was sexually abusing boys, people would look back and they would see all these red flags. They would say, oh yes, he was doing this and he was doing this, which are all grooming behaviors. And, I knew there was something wrong with that. But ultimately, before the sexual abuse was detected, people didn't necessarily identify those things. But once it was known that somebody has engaged in sexual abuse, therefore they are more likely to say, oh yes, those were all sexual grooming behaviors. We are better at identifying physical behaviors that involve physical touch. So you'll see, and I'll describe those shortly, those are our highest level red flag sexual grooming behaviors. So those are, the touching, the increased sexual touching, the hugging of the child. Those are more easily identifiable and people are more familiar with those. And so we can more easily see that those are boundary violations, and people recognize those even before sexual abuse is perpetrated to be, potentially red flag behaviors. And I've been asked to, testify in cases where people are engaging in those types of behaviors and sexual abuse has not necessarily occurred, but to talk about how those boundary violations may be reflective of sexual grooming. And we've recently done some research looking at how people are able to detect sexual grooming behaviors. And generally people are not great, generally less than chance, like less than 50%. But we suspected that parents might be a little bit better because parents tend to be more informed about what's going on and the dangers to their child. But we found that parents are no better than non-parents at detecting sexual grooming behaviors. So we talked earlier about the definition of sexual grooming and what was kind of going on in the literature. And based on that, we developed what was called the sexual grooming model, the SGM, which involved 5 different stages. The first one is the victim selection stage, in which the perpetrator selects a victim that is vulnerable, and so that they can more easily perpetrate the abuse. The next stage is the gaining access stage, and this varies depending upon the context. So some people, especially if they're not related to the individual, need to gain access to the child. So either by integrating themselves in a youth serving organization, taking the child on overnight stays, befriending the family, etc. If it's a family member or a close acquaintance, they might have easier access to the child. The middle stage is the kind of the hallmark of the grooming behavior is the trust development. And this is where they're developing trust with the child, the family, and those around them. And that's when you're seeing a lot of those positive behaviors, like, the positive reinforcement, the affection, the sharing of the gifts, things like that. The last stage before the abuse happens is desensitization to sexual content and touch. So this is where you see they're gradually pushing the boundaries. So they'll start to integrate more sexual language. They might introduce pornography. The touch, increases in terms of like, there'll be longer touches. They might start touching, the shoulder, then moving down to the leg and closer to the crotch area. So the child becomes more comfortable with themselves being touched. And so that boundary is more easily violated. This is also where you'll see nudity. They'll watch the child undress. They themselves will be naked around the child. And then that's usually at the stage at which the sexual abuse happens. And following the abuse, the perpetrator will engage in post-abuse maintenance, and that's to minimize the likelihood of detection and to, in many cases, facilitate the ongoing abuse. And so this model was developed based on our review of the literature. We had reviewed all the studies that had been conducted at that time. Those were the kind of overarching stages that emerged from the research. We also identified 77 different sexual grooming behaviors in the literature. And so in order to content validate it, we conducted a survey where we found everybody who was doing this type of research, and we identified 99 experts in the field, 44 of which had active email addresses. We had 18 people participate, which was a 40.9% response rate, which might seem low, but in research terms, actually a pretty high response rate. And they kind of gave us whether they thought the stages that we identified and the behaviors which we were able to glean from the research were relevant to sexual grooming, and also which stage those behaviors were relevant to. We used what was called a content validation index, when anything over above 0.78 is considered to be part of the construct. And so all 5 stages that we identified in the sexual grooming model were deemed by the experts to be relevant, ranging from 0.88 to 0.94, and 42 of the 77 behaviors, so a little more than half of the behaviors that were identified from the research literature were identified to be relevant to sexual grooming. And then based on where they were identified to, we organized them by stage. So these are the behaviors you can see. So in the victim selection, we found that children who were victimized were compliant and trusting of adults. They lacked confidence or had low self-esteem. They tended to be lonely, or isolated, or troubled. That could be generally psychologically troubled. They may be needy. They felt unwanted or unloved. A common theme that we're seeing in our research is that they're reporting that they're not close to their parents, or parents aren't a resource for them. This is a controversial topic, but historically, perpetrators would select children who were lacking in a father. They were from single parent homes. Generally, the father was absent. And so because the majority of perpetrators still are men, they would seek to fill that role, and they would fill the father role and gain access to the child that way. And another common theme that we see is that children lack supervision. In the second stage, gaining access and isolation, the perpetrators would be involved in youth-serving organizations. So those are for people who don't have easy access to the child through either, they're related to them or they have connections to their family. They may manipulate the family to gain access to the child. So they might integrate themselves. They become, like Uncle Bob. So they're spending a lot of time around the family. They become another member of the family. They may offer to take, the children out to do activities alone without adults. So they would take them, like to the park or to the playground. We're seeing a lot of the abuse happening on overnight stays and outings. So this can happen in the context of youth serving organizations. So like, for example, in the Boy Scouts, a lot of the abuse was happening, in the overnight stays. Or it could be like they're having a sleepover with somebody, with the adult, or the adult is kind of babysitting for the parent. And they're separating the child from peers and family. And that can be both physically and psychologically separating the child. So kind of saying, you really shouldn't hang out with those people anymore, or your parents really don't care about you as much as I care about you. Or they can also just physically take them away from their family. In the trust development stage, they often portray themselves to be charming, nice, and likable. They have insider status within the community. And so they're kind of considered, you often hear that they were a pillar of the community. They're affectionate and loving to the child. So again, it's hard to imagine that somebody who cares about a child would do this to them, but that's how they portray themselves. They give the child a lot of attention. And if you go back to the victim selection, that's kind of targeting a lot of those needs that the child is missing. They might show favoritism to the child or have a special relationship with them. They'll give them compliments. They spend time with the child and they communicate often. Now, one of the things that you often will see is that they're text messaging with the child, because that's their way, because now that kids all have cell phones, that's their way of getting around the parent or the guardian, so they can contact the child via text message. And so that's a red flag. If an adult is text messaging with your child, you want to make sure that you're aware of why they are, and they really shouldn't be in most cases. Especially with younger children, they engage in childlike activities like playing stories, games, engaging in sports, sharing similar music interests. And these are the behaviors that are often, identical to normal and healthy adult-child interactions. They may give the child rewards and privileges like gifts, toys, treats, money, and trips. And then, as I mentioned, we saw among especially adolescents, they're providing drugs or alcohol. And this is both to kind of desensitize them, but also because youth also may be seeking drugs or alcohol, and they become a source of the drugs and alcohol. And then the fourth stage is the desensitization to sexual content and physical contact, asking questions about the child's sexual experiences and relationships. You see that among adolescents. They talk about the sexual things that they themselves have done, so sexual behaviors they have partaken in. They might use inappropriate sexual language, tell dirty jokes. We see that especially in youth serving organizations. They start using these types of more sexualized types of jokes. They might teach the child sexual education, and this is not in health class, so they'll talk about what sex is like, and this is not a parent or a guardian who might be discussing this. This is somebody who shouldn't be talking to the child about what sexuality is all about. They might use accidental touching or distraction while touching. So, they might start rubbing the child up and down on the leg while talking to them about, their day or what's going on with them, or talking about something unrelated. So the child is kind of talking, but they're touching them in a way that child might not necessarily feel comfortable with. They might watch the child undress or expose their own naked body. So we see oftentimes showering with the child. They may show them pornography, magazines, or videos. There might be seemingly innocent non-sexual contact, like hugs that start to be longer and, like arms around each other, or, things like that. And then the desensitization to touch, increasing sexual touching. So the touching becomes increasingly sexual in nature or closer to the genital area. At that point, then the abuse happens. And in the post-abuse maintenance behaviors, they tell the child to not tell anyone what happened. They encourage secret keeping. They'll also tell them that they love them and they're special, so that they don't want to lose that relationship. They might, give them rewards or bribes to avoid the punishment. They might persuade the child that what they did was acceptable, and that it was normal behavior, or they might misstate moral standards regarding the touch. So, this is perfectly okay. People engage in this behavior all the time. They might make the victim feel responsible, that, you didn't do anything, you wanted it, you kept coming back, you showed me that you wanted me to do that. Or they might threaten to abandon the child if they do disclose that. If they disclose that their relationship will be over, they'll have to go to jail, they might get in trouble, their family's not going to believe them, family could break up, etc. So based on these 42 items that were identified by the experts, we developed the sexual grooming scale victim version, the SGSV. And so that enabled us to do the first kind of quantitative study of sexual grooming behaviors. And we pilot tested it with 115 adult victims of child sexual abuse to establish the feasibility of the measure. And these were individuals who endorsed that they experienced child sexual abuse. And so they, completed the measure via self-report anonymously. And on average, we found that behaviors were endorsed across all 5 stages, that in most cases, especially the victim selection and the desensitization to sexual contact and sexual content, that there were high numbers of people who were endorsing at least one item. That you can see that in some areas that 3 to 4 items were being endorsed, and on average 15 items out of the 42 were endorsed by those individuals who reported experiencing childhood sexual abuse. So this is our latest research that was just published last week via open access. We identified red flag sexual grooming behaviors. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest critiques of the sexual grooming literature is how to distinguish, the normative healthy behaviors from those behaviors that are nefarious or that have negative that are indicative of child sexual abuse. And so what we did is we compared the behaviors that were endorsed by individuals, a sample of adults who had experienced childhood sexual abuse, 411 of them, and those who did not. And then those who did not experience childhood sexual abuse, we had them complete the scale. We randomized them in one of three different conditions. They completed the scale for an adult male who was either a family member, a non-family member, or a community member. And then we kind of looked at the differences between endorsement for those people who experienced sexual abuse and those who did not. And the results are pretty startling. So these are the odds ratios. And again, this paper was just published and it's open access if anybody is interested in looking at it. But you can see that the odds ratios between those who were abused and those who were not abused were particularly high for the behaviors in stage 4, which is desensitization, sexual content, and contact, up to 30 times more likely with the increasing sexual touching. But we also saw small and moderate differences between groups where, in victim selection, gaining access and isolation, trust development, and post-abuse maintenance was also very high, which is to be expected, obviously, because those are behaviors that happen after the abuse occurs and wouldn't necessarily make sense in those contexts. We also then compared the behaviors, depending on the relationship to the victim, and these largely held true. The effect sizes, the only differences were the overnight stays were not significant when it was a family member, nor was saying I love you or showing affection. That was very common, but pretty much everything else remains similar. We've also then started looking at differences in grooming behaviors by different groups or populations. And so we had access to the database of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. So these were all the priests who were, who had credible allegations of sexual abuse levied against them. And so what we did is we used our measure, and we kind of coded the surveys that were identified for grooming behaviors. So we were obviously limited in that they did not use our measure in coding. And so a lot of the behaviors were not necessarily reported on, but we did see evidence of gaining access or isolation. So they used their role, priests, clergy used their role in the church to meet victims and socialize with families. In terms of trust development, a variety of gifts or other enticements were used by the clergy. And then we saw that there was desensitization, including sexualized conversation and physical contact. What was interesting was we did not see as much in terms of the victim selection. So we did not see that they were particularly targeting vulnerable victims. We expected, due to the nature of the abuse, a lot of it was happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so that they would maybe target children who are coming from single parent homes, but that was not necessarily the case. The majority of the families from the database were intact. And what we hypothesized was that because the majority of the children that they were targeting were involved in some capacity as like altar boys or later altar girls, that they already had access to these children because of their role. What we also found that was interesting and kind of worked on the work of Jason Spreitz and his colleagues was that the clergy used their role in persona Christi, so that they used spiritual manipulation to some extent, and so that they used their role as a representative of God to kind of have that power differential and to kind of engage in like the grooming of the family, but also the child as well. And in some cases, it was used explicitly where they would say that, you know, God will punish you if you tell anybody, that kind of thing. We then also looked at sexual grooming within the Boy Scouts of America. So this is a piece that is currently submitted and revised and resubmit. There is a publicly available database of individuals who were had credible allegations of sexual abuse within the Boy Scouts of America. And so we went through and while there are thousands of them, not all of them had adequate data for coding. And so we went through and found 203 cases where there was enough data that we could code. Again, you know, these were they had reports from either there was a child statement, there was a police report, or there was some additional information. So not all the information that we needed was there. So this is obviously limited in scope, but we did see that behaviors across all 5 stages were evident. We saw that the most common behaviors were in the gaining access and isolation, where 60% were doing activities alone with the child. So this was within the context of their role within the Boy Scouts, but we also saw that they were kind of taking the children outside of that and taking them on overnight stays at their home, things like that. They were spending a lot of time or communicating often with the child. And a common thing that was found in the 4th stage was watching the child undress. One of the papers that we have just submitted is on sibling sexual abuse. We gathered data from over 600 individuals who are adults, but who had experienced child sexual abuse as children. So about 6% of the individuals reported that the perpetrator of the abuse was a biological sibling. And we saw that even in these sibling dyads, a lot of these behaviors were common. It was often a minor sibling, indicating that they were under the age of 18, but they were older than the child. The child was generally under the age of 12, and the sibling was generally post-puberty. But we saw that in many cases, one of the key was that there was inadequate adult supervision of the children. Or that the child was compliant and trusting of their sibling. They were doing activities alone with the child. They were spending a lot of time together, which is somewhat obvious given that they're siblings. There was exposing of the naked body and then telling of secrets or keeping of secrets and telling the child not to tell. We've also we haven't analyzed this data yet, but looking at sexual grooming that is perpetrated by females. So some recent research has estimated that up to a little over 12% of all sexual abuse, this is based on self-report, but it's a meta-analysis by Franca Cortoni and her colleagues, 12% of sexual abuse is perpetrated by females, and 40% of all sexual abuse against males is perpetrated by a female. And what we have seen is that similar to what was going on in the Ghislaine Maxwell case, that this can be happening in sex trafficking, that we're seeing grooming, that women are using grooming behaviors to entrap other young women in the sex trafficking industry, or that, as in the case of Mary Kay Letourneau, there's the teacher lover, where it's an adult who is having a quote unquote romantic relationship with a student under their care. Obviously, this is also sexual abuse. We're still gathering that data, and we'll hopefully next time we meet, I will be able to share that with you. We've also done some work on online sexual grooming. I know there are a lot of other researchers who are doing research in this space, but there's a problem in terms of the definition of online sexual grooming, because a lot of it is solicitation versus grooming. So the grooming is the formation of a relationship, where the solicitation can be kind of a one and done type thing. And so sometimes the two terms are used interchangeably in the sexual grooming online literature. And there's varying purposes to online sexual grooming. In many cases, it's to get child sex abuse material, so that they get the child to send them images, which then they use and to share in public forums, or in terms of they'll blackmail the child with those images. Some people will engage in sexual grooming for fantasy purposes alone, so that they have no intention of meeting the child or engaging in any contact sexual abuse. but they have a fantasy where they're engaging in sexual abuse virtually. And in some cases, you get the offline sexual contact where they will meet the child online and then they will seek to have sexual contact with them offline. So they will meet in person where they will engage in person sexual abuse. What's very interesting is David Finkelhor and his colleagues just did a nationally representative sample of young adults, and they asked them about their experiences. I think they were 18 to 22 of online sexual abuse. And they found that individuals who reported being sexually groomed online, 80% of them knew the individual who had sexually groomed them before the grooming started. So this is kind of contrary to a lot of the typical things that we're hearing about online sexual grooming, which is it's a stranger that's contacting children. So what is happening is, if any of you have young teenagers, as I'm kind of learning now, is that like on apps like Snapchat or Instagram, there'll be friends of friends that they will contact them. So they aren't necessarily there, or they might be an older sibling of somebody that they might know. So these are not necessarily strangers to our children, but they might be somebody who's kind of peripheral to their network, and then they will friend them or get into their DMs, and then they will start grooming them that way, and they'll take the abuse. They'll either engage in get the child sexual abuse material, or they'll engage in offline contact with the individual. And because they're known to them, they're often located geographically more closely, and so the offline abuse can happen more easily. We did analyze some online transcripts that were obtained by a group that would kind of portray themselves to be children, and then they would try to kind of entrap individuals, and they provide those transcripts to law enforcement. What we found coding some of those transcripts is that individuals generally don't portray themselves as minors. They will tend to portray themselves as adults. They might lie about their age by a few years, but they will not generally say that they are minors. A lot of the sexual grooming behaviors that are used mirror the in-person sexual grooming behaviors that we just talked about. They often introduce sexual topics within the first day of contact, and generally in about 30 minutes. And so unlike in-person sexual abuse, where that grooming can take months and even years for that relationship to form, the benefit of the internet is that it can happen very quickly. And so what people will often do is they'll have multiple people that they're trying to entrap at once. And so they'll introduce those sexual, comments, or ask for pictures very quickly, and they'll see, which children respond and which children do not, and then they'll pursue those children that are responding and that are going along with it. And so they're not wasting their time. The majority of the people in one study took conversations offline, and so they'll start to contact them via telephone, or via text messaging, or via different platforms that all the young people have today that as a parent I'm trying to keep up with. And what we saw in many cases in the survey that we did of young people who reported contacting adults online is that a lot of young people who meet adults online and then take it offline with them, they view these as consensual relationships. So they're viewing that adult as their boyfriend. So these are teenagers. So they're generally young women, ages 14 through 18, and they're engaging, with adults, varying ages, but who are above the age of 18, but they are viewing that person as their boyfriend. And so they're agreeing to meet them, and they engage in what they deem to be consensual sexual relationships. But obviously, because of their age, they cannot consent. So why is it important to really understand sexual grooming? I think we'll go through these, and I think there are a variety of different reasons that it's important for primary prevention, investigation, prosecution, evaluation, and treatment. And then I'll talk about some of the research that we have ongoing. Primary prevention efforts, knowing how people engage in sexual grooming behaviors and their modus operandi, I think can be very helpful in establishing policies and procedures. Having things like adults cannot text children, for youth serving organizations. Adults cannot drive children home alone. Adults cannot be alone watching children showering. They cannot take children on overnight trips. So policies and procedures that target some of these red flag grooming behaviors, I think, would be very important. Educational materials and programs are also really important. Some of you may be familiar with Aaron's and Jenna's laws. These now are, many states have passed these laws, and they mandate education on childhood sexual abuse for teachers, children, and parents. And so we're now doing a study where we're coding different state materials for the content of sexual grooming. But the more that we talk about sexual grooming and which behaviors encompass sexual grooming, the more that we're able to kind of proactively kind of identify the behaviors before the abuse occurs. And, sometimes, and we're not saying that, every person who engages in these behaviors is engaging in sexual grooming, but again, depending on the type of behavior that's observed, this might be something that you're going to want to put in, additional precautions in place. You might want to talk to the people about boundary violations. Some cases, that might be the individual is not going to be unsupervised around children because they've engaged in these types of behaviors. But the more that we're aware, and that people who have contact with children and guardians and parents are aware of it, and even children, I talk to my own children about these types of behaviors and what to do if they experience them and who they should tell. In terms of investigation, I think it can be very helpful in building a case if the individual is familiar with sexual grooming and the different tactics that are used. We've been collaborating with a child forensic interviewer to adapt our measure to be used in cases of childhood sexual abuse, where we can, query the child in a non-leading type of way about the behaviors that we've identified as sexual grooming to see if they've experienced any of those. It can help law enforcement identify grooming behaviors in child sexual abuse cases. And it might also help to identify additional evidence or victims if we understand the modus operandi that the individual is using. There are sexual grooming laws in various states. Again, going back to our definition of sexual grooming, some of those, talk about grooming. Some of those have nothing to do with sexual grooming. And so, some states actually will have laws that will prevent if somebody is engaging in some of these behaviors before the abuse has happened, they can be prosecuted. I think it's going to be very hard still to do that. But, if once the abuse has already occurred, lawyers can use evidence of the tactics to kind of increase the to prove the case that these behaviors have happened. We cannot say one way or the other if somebody has groomed somebody or not based on their behaviors, but we can say like these are sexual grooming behaviors and these are the behaviors that the individual has engaged in. And this is what we know, and these are red flag grooming behaviors. And we're seeing the use of sexual grooming used increasingly in civil cases to indicate the presence of sexual abuse, and that people should have recognized that the abuse should have happened, that the abuse was likely to occur. You want to use sexual grooming for evaluation when you're working with those who perpetrated to inform for future risk. You want to know if they did use sexual grooming behaviors, and this can be helpful in recommendations for probation and parole and treatment providers, because in terms of treatment, you want to identify kind of offense cycles of those who perpetrate sexual abuse, how grooming might come into play. If they have groomed themselves and they have cognitive distortions, that would be important to know and something to be targeted in treatment. It can be used in to inform relapse prevention or self-management plans. And it's also very helpful, and we found for those who provide services to individuals who've experienced sexual abuse and their loved ones, because there's a lot of guilt and shame that's associated with child sexual abuse for the individual who's been victimized, and also for the parents and guardians, because they feel like I should have done something. And recognizing, that the perpetrator has engaged in grooming and how grooming works and how it really wasn't their fault, and that they were, that they had been groomed, helps alleviate some of the guilt of the individual, because oftentimes, the children felt like I went along with it, I didn't stop it, I didn't tell anybody, why didn't I do it? Or the parents feel like they weren't able to see that the person, that they were close to was actually abusing their children. And recognizing that sexual grooming came to play can be kind of healing for those who are survivors of sexual abuse. In terms of research, we have a lot of projects that we're still working on, and Some of those include the validation of our model, which we are just in the process of writing up right now. We want to see which behaviors might be more predictive of sexual abuse, which is going to be challenging, but we're working on that. We're looking at the relationship between sexual grooming and reporting and psychological well-being. We're finding in preliminary work that sexual grooming, the more grooming behaviors that the perpetrator engaged in, especially the stage 5 behaviors, the less likely individuals are to report. Similarly, the more guilt and shame people are reporting, which then leads to increased levels of depression and suicidal behavior and trauma symptoms. We are now also, you may have heard that people are referring to sexual grooming as it pertains to adults. So we are conducting research in that area. We've kind of extended our model, looking at the adult sexual abuse literature, finding many similarities because, again, the majority of adults are offended against by somebody who is known to them. Most commonly, a former or current intimate partner or an acquaintance. Only in 20% of the cases is the perpetrator a stranger. And so we're seeing that a lot of the language in terms of coercive control, sexual coercion, and sexual harassment has a lot of overlap with sexual grooming. So we want to kind of explore whether our model will translate to adult sexual abuse as well. We're continuing to look at sexual grooming within the context of various different organizations. Our next project is looking at it within sporting, individuals, because of the nature of sports and the coach child interaction involved in sports. It's ripe for sexual abuse, and we're looking at the role that grooming may play there. And we're looking to extend and do more research in online sexual grooming and how, what we know about sexual grooming is being translated into the online platform. So in terms of cultural considerations, I think this is an area that is definitely ripe and that we need to do so much more research on. Those of you who are familiar with the child sex abuse research in general, it's really failed to look at sexual abuse kind of within and across race and ethnicity and culture. And sexual grooming has really not been looked at across different cultures or ethnic groups at all. And so that's something that we're hoping to do to see if there are differences. I mean, we know that, children from various cultural and ethnic groups are more vulnerable, such as, Black, Latino, Indigenous children. And so we really don't know if issues related to race and diversity impact, the types of grooming behaviors that are exhibited and how that pertains to both the race and gender identity and all that of the perpetrator and or of the child. We know that kids who identify as belonging to a sexual minority are at increased risk for being sexually abused. And we're seeing, increased risks of abuse online. And so we suspect that those individuals are also more likely to be targeted as victims of sexual grooming. So that is all that I have for you today. I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have. And I thank you for your attention today. I greatly appreciate you being here so soon after the new year.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. This has been eye-opening, both in terms of what we know, what we haven't figured out until now, what we still have to learn about grooming and getting on the same page of what grooming is in general. Yeah. I will navigate through. We have a lot of questions here. I will do the best I can to ask a couple of those for Dr. Jeglic, and shortly there will be a link for the APA continuing education credits in the chat. We have a question from somebody, I believe it's from professional experience, asking about when testifying about child sexual abuse disclosure and grooming techniques, that from their experience, defense attorneys have argued that these topics have become common knowledge and expert witness testimony thus should not be allowed. Their question is, what's your experience with this? And are there particular things that you believe is that would benefit educating juries about these topics?
I mean, I think, I've had many instances where people really are not still familiar with sexual grooming. And I think, the research that we've been doing lately is, some of the, I think grooming has been around for about 10, 15 years, kind of in the general layman literature. But in terms of like kind of looking at it from like a Daubert-Frye perspective, it's only recently that we have some data on this kind of information and identifying specific behaviors. And I think, the more concrete we can be and the more research we have before can be very helpful in testifying. I think, if people are interested, we're happy to share our research and how that can be useful in testifying. I still get contacted very frequently by attorneys to talk about sexual grooming behaviors, what behaviors might be indicative of sexual grooming, because I think while there might be common knowledge, not everybody knows all the nuances and how that might come into play.
Certainly. Thank you. We had a couple of questions. I think this gets to what you were talking about near the end, as far as understanding more about grooming related to adults who have also been victimized. Someone asked if you've done any research on the application of this model to adults where there's also that power differential, such as doctor-patient, clergy, layperson, et cetera.
Yeah. And so that's kind of what we're working on right now. I have a case study in Revise and Resubmit where there was kind of a employer-employee dynamic in the grooming, but we are hearing anecdotally that there's this power differential. What we see is oftentimes an older individual and a younger emerging adult. So we see, people kind of, they are adults, they can consent, but they still are kind of younger. In their early to mid 20s, and the individual is much older and they have different status. So it might be a celebrity, it might be somebody who holds a position of power within the context of employment, or a variety of different things like a clergy member. And so we are seeing, again, anecdotally, and we're currently running a study where we're gathering quantitative data on adult sexual grooming, but we are seeing that a lot of the same behaviors are emerging and these same themes are coming out. So hopefully in the next year, we'll have more information for you there, but I do suspect that a lot of this will hold out. I think some of the behaviors might be different. I think the harder thing is going to be, because of the age of consent, is it unethical, or is this sexual abuse? It's going to be a bit of a quagmire, but we're seeing, because of a lot of these behaviors are coercive in nature, and you see overlap with the sexual coercion and coercive control, which, you can then talk about how that impacts consent. So we'll see where that goes, but that's kind of where we are right now.
Seems rooted in some of that. What is the difference between misconduct versus offense conversations that we've had before?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Somebody else asked along those lines, but perhaps less of that gray area, about therapist sexual grooming and misconduct, particularly therapists of children and teens. If you've seen research or done research on how therapist sexual abusers of children fit into the model that you have here.
I haven't really, there's not a lot of data on therapist sexual abuse. I would suspect that a lot of it, again, because of the power differential, they have the access, they have the isolation of the child, they have that trust development so that they would be able to groom children more easily. I have seen some of the literature kind of looking at grooming within the medical profession and how doctors might groom patients. And I think a lot of it would translate to the therapist-patient relationship. So I think that, it's definitely, I think, something that probably goes on. We don't see as much of it. I have not looked at the data there yet, but I think that it probably does happen. And I think many of the dynamics are the same, but because of the nature of the relationship, that the gaining access and isolation is a lot easier because the child is being brought to them and they have that relationship with the child.
Seems like we're getting a lot of questions that kind of center on this overall theme of having conversations about these issues. I guess the first one I'll ask is, would you recommend a discussion of grooming behaviors in the context specifically of sex offending treatment, perhaps of raising somebody's awareness of self-grooming or grooming they've engaged in their offenses?
Yeah, and based on our recent research, it looks like, offenders, whether they, and again, it's still kind of up in the air whether this is a conscious or unconscious. I think some people do it planfully. I think some of the strategies and techniques, like there was one study that was done back, I think, and I forgot the author's name, but I think it was like in '89, where they interviewed perpetrators of child sexual abuse about how they selected their victims and how they engaged in the abuse. And some of them were very planful, and they kind of developed this modus operandi that worked for them, and they would repeat it over and over again. Other people, I think, are less aware of the strategies that they use, and I think a lot a lot of the lines of like the cognitive distortion literature. I think some of people delude themselves along the way, but I think it could be very helpful to understand what sexual grooming is in the context of treatment, how that came to play out in the offense process for that individual, and then know that those might be risk factors for them, and how they can kind of address those and minimize the risk going forward.
It seems like in research and in general, I think a lot of people have had, they have a natural discussion of with sex offense treatment that people that have perpetrated abuse have been abused themselves, and how that might be relevant to discuss and bring up during treatment. Someone asked a question here about basically applying that to grooming, if there's any knowledge about similarities for people that have been abused and go on to abuse, if they were groomed in similar ways that perhaps they groomed themselves.
Again, based on anecdotal evidence, I think that there is some, overlap there and some similarity. We don't have research on that yet. Again, I think it's an area that still needs to be developed. We do know that those who perpetrate abuse are increased risk for having been abused themselves. But obviously the majority of people who are abused do not go on to perpetrate abuse. But we do see some commonalities in terms of, victim selection, things like that. So it is possible. And I think that we, as the research develops, we'll probably have more answers for you in that point.
Any advice on helping parents deal with ambivalence around the need to use this info functionally, just how we can use this to help educate parents and process it?
Yeah, it's tough. As I wrote my book for parents because I was a parent myself, and I think these are hard things to know. And, like, is this person somebody who is a good person and a positive influence in your child's life, or is this something that you have to be mindful of? And so I think, you want to know what sexual grooming is, talk to your kids, talk about boundaries. But then, if you're seeing some of these behaviors, and I think I would look at that red flag grooming paper that we just wrote, and if you're observing these behaviors, I would err on the side of caution, especially if you're getting up into what we kind of consider the higher risk behaviors, like those physical contact, and if they're texting your child, going around you, things like that, giving your child gifts. Those are all things that you want to kind of, you want to peak your radar, I guess, and you want to make sure that your child is not going to be alone with that individual. You don't have to necessarily cut them out, but you want to put in those protections in place. And talk to your child and let them know if anything ever feels uncomfortable, if something happens, that you are there for them as a resource, and that you will help them navigate that situation.
All right, I'll throw out one final question here. We appreciate all the time and for staying over the hour here. I guess sort of related to this, how do we educate? Some people have brought up the idea that this term grooming has also been brought up more broadly in mainstream media, talking about material around sexuality, queer, trans people. If you could comment on this phenomenon and how to address the communication of these behaviors being described as grooming in media and otherwise.
So I've written a little bit about that. I've blogged for Psychology Today, and I was interviewed by a few media outlets on it. And I'm very kind of firm in the sense that we should not use grooming to describe those types of behaviors. That is not sexual grooming. What other people feel about those things, that is, I think grooming should be, used for the context for sexual grooming. Because if we use grooming in other contexts, it confuses it and it makes it less clear. I think that those are two different phenomena. They are separate. They have nothing to do with one another. And I think that the more that we dilute the term, the more dangerous it is, because we are 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys are sexually abused by the time they're 18. So it's a huge problem. And we need to be able to, identify that. And so we want grooming to refer to sexual grooming. We want to educate people about sexual grooming and not confuse it with other, unrelated, constructs or things that have nothing to do with sexual abuse.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jeglic, for sharing your expertise and for a very engaging and very informative conversation. It's been a pleasure to see you as always. That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We will see you next week with Dan Murray talking about mitigation in capital evaluations. And we hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, week, and new year.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me, and great to see you too. Take care.
you.
Happy New Year, everyone.